Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Harding, and the topic I chose to present on was international terrorism. Uh, Terrorism is one of those terms where the definitions should sort of be obvious, but that's not always the case. It's one of those things where you think you should know it when you see it, but like I said, that's not always the case. For instance, you had incidences in the 1960s and 70s where someone like Nelson Mandela, who was part of the African National Congress, uh, was labeled a terrorist, and the group to which he belonged, the African National Congress, was labeled a terrorist group by the South African government. More recently, regimes like the ones in Jordan or Egypt pre-Arab Spring, uh, the governments there would oftentimes label the opposition terrorists. But I guess for our purposes, the simple definition of terrorism is the use or threatened use of violence against others for some political or ideological goal. Uh, in this instance, international terrorism then would be violence that's used for a political or ideological goal, but which crosses national borders. And because of the global world we live in, this is something that's become easier and easier, particularly in the 21st century. Like I say, the thing about borders is important because although we have them, and most countries have borders, the fact that we live in a global world makes it so that just about anyone can get a passport, hop a flight from one continent to another, and kind of with the relative ease of travel makes fighting international terrorism a more difficult problem. More recent prominent examples everyone will probably be familiar with would be the September 11th attacks in the United States, in New York, Washington, D.C., and in Virginia, where the death tolls were in excess of almost 3,000 people. This was the largest terrorist attack in U.S. history, and I want to say the largest successful attack after Pearl Harbor. Its second terrorist attack was the Fort Hood shooting in 2009. That was actually perpetrated by an American citizen who was in the United States Army, who had begun to sort of, I don't know if fall victim is the right word to use, but who had begun to become radicalized by Islamic groups. He went on a shooting spree. Ultimately, he was captured and convicted. The third attack, excuse me, was actually in San Bernardino in 2015. That was actually something that kind of hit close to home. I mean, that's in the area in which most of us live, most of us go to school, and in that instance, 16 people were killed by an individual who was an American citizen and his wife, who was I believe she was a Saudi national. This actually, like I said, hit close to home. I work for the county of San Bernardino, and the particular department that I work with, social services department, actually liaised with the department that was the site of the attack. And I mean, I didn't know any of the individuals, but some of the people I worked with, or I work with, I should say, did know them, and it was sort of a horrifying thing to think could happen, sort of like in your backyard. And as I say, the problem of terrorism is one which isn't new, but has changed radically, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. You would think that terrorism just by itself would be a problem. Unfortunately, some of the methods for combating terrorism have also caused what I would label sort of second order problems. In this instance, the tactics resulting from policies put into place after 9/11 sort of created problems of their own. If anyone remembers, I don't know how old exactly everyone in the class is. In the aftermath of 9/11, the government obviously believed that it had failed at protecting its citizens. And right after Congress passed the Patriot Act, which strengthened the government's power to issue things like wiretaps and strengthened terrorism charges that could be added to uh, charges that which had already been uh, levied against individuals suspected of committing terrorist acts. Now, like in both instances, in the case of like wiretaps and terrorism charges, those things had already existed pre 9/11, and of course, you could prosecute someone for committing an act of terrorism or seek a court order for a wiretap. What happened after 9/11 is that some of the, I guess you call them barriers to obtaining something like a warrant for a wiretap were lowered, so that instead of like probable cause, now it was only reasonable suspicion. Historically, most emergencies, national or otherwise, have had an endpoint. So if you think of something like the Civil War in the United States, or World War II, or the Korean War, sometimes the government has to sort of go to extremes to protect the national security. Like so, in World War II, you had things like the internment of the Japanese. The Korean War, you had the president at the time, Truman, trying to nationalize certain industries, like the steel industry, for the national defense. The thing is, in those instances, of course, the wars always came to an end. You had a peace treaty signed, or the enemy was defeated. With the war on terror, there isn't really a defined end goal or end state that is readily identifiable. So you've had sort of some people leading to or referring to the war on terror as a sort of forever war, which has actually only expanded over time. So when you think about it, the initial attacks of September 11th are almost 20 years ago at this point. When we initially went in, it was into Afghanistan, later Iraq. At this point, the U.S. is actually fighting the same terrorist group, Al Qaeda, more or less, but now fighting them in several territories around the world. In addition to this, you had what were the implementation of certain policies, which I would argue caused, or I suppose I should say, contributed to these sort of like second order problems. The three main ones that I decided to tackle were enhanced interrogation, extraordinary rendition, and targeted killings. In the instance of enhanced interrogation, it was sort of a euphemism for what was basically torture. In the US, both under federal law and under the Uniform Court of Military Justice, torture is prohibited. It's not something that you can do. If you do it, you're supposed to be prosecuted. What happened after 9/11 was that the government, under then George W. Bush, authorized the use of enhanced interrogation under the executive branch. This continued for a period of about 3 or 4 years after 9/11, so until about 2005, 2006. It was officially ended in 2009. I don't know if anyone remembers, but they sort of news flash where you had instances of extreme behavior on the part of U.S. officials, soldiers, and CIA agents against suspected terrorists, people who hadn't even been convicted but who were suspected of being terrorists. If anyone remembers the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, or Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. You had people doing things like waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and fake executions. In some of those cases, particularly in the Guantanamo Bay example, uh, some of the soldiers were prosecuted, and there was some talk at the time of going after higher ups, uh, but that was more or less left at just prosecuting the uh, junior officers and junior enlisted. The next tactic that was used in the War on Terror was the policy of extraordinary rendition. This was a practice of taking suspected terrorists and suspected illegal combatants, and instead of bringing them to the US for interrogation, they would be taken to third countries. This was in order to evade US law which prohibited torture, and sort of try to get around that provision. These interrogations were used in territories and countries outside the jurisdiction of America, and for the most part, there aren't any confirmed sites, but at the time, reported suspected sites in Poland, Egypt, the Czech Republic, and Jordan. Now, this practice is actually still ongoing. It didn't stop at the same time that the enhanced interrogations did. At this time, so we're told, uh, suspected terrorists are taken to third countries and interrogated. The third tactic that is actually still ongoing as well is that of targeted killing. As the name implies, these are a method of assassination used as a means of deterrence in instances where the targeted individual can't be apprehended. In the modern era, this was largely conducted via aerial unmanned drones. And the current program is run by both the US Air Force and CIA. In all instances, kill lists are compiled by the executive branch agencies and departments, with the added proviso that these kill lists have virtually no method to contest. So if your name hypothetically were on a kill list, there'd be no way for you to find out why your name was put on there, how it was put on there, and to take it off. In 2010, in 2011, Anwar al-Awlaki was killed in a drone attack. And about 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, was killed in Yemen, also by a drone attack. In both instances, these both were American citizens. Anwar al-Awlaki was, I think, born in Phoenix, Arizona. His son was also born in Phoenix. And the controversy around this particular use of targeted killing arose because, as both of them are American citizens, both are entitled to minimum instances of due process, and neither were afforded that. The argument goes, for those who supported the killing, is that al-Awlaki was a member of Al-Qaeda, he supported their activities, and he was an illegal combatant. The argument against the killing was that as the government, generally, if you're under suspicion of committing some type of crime, the government has to prove that you've done what they say you've done. That they have to provide evidence in an open court. You should be able to confront your accusers. And in this case, none of that happened. He was put on a list and killed. And as I kind of intimated before, I labeled this slide sort of a second order problems, largely because although you have the main problem of terrorism, these three policies have contributed to, and I'd say like exacerbated the, not necessarily the problem of terrorism, but the way we go about it. The specific tactics, which were the result of new counterterrorism policies, did a lot to engender bad will, not just in Muslim communities around the world, but in the world at large. And as far as anyone can tell, we don't know how effective each of these methods were. As I said, targeted killing is still going on. There's still some debate as to how effective it is. Obviously, it kills the people that it targets, but we don't know how effective that is at lessening the or mitigating the problem of terrorism. With regards to enhanced interrogation, we do know, in fact, that none of the information that was garnered in that method ever yielded usable intelligence in aid of counterterrorism efforts. Just the opposite, actually. The intelligence that led to the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound was actually obtained through regular, I guess you'd call it, police interrogation by the FBI of the suspected associate of bin Laden. He wasn't tortured. He was interviewed using standard police procedures. And some of the outcomes of the global war on terror, just in general, it's cost a lot, both in lives and money spent. The 2009 requested budget for the Department of Defense on its own is $717 billion, and almost $9.5 billion of that is just for the unmanned drone program. The 2019 budget for Homeland Security is just over $40 billion. Then the total cost for the war on terror is almost $6 trillion, and that's over 20 years. It includes the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the total cost for fighting the war on terror standing almost at $6 trillion. And part of the problem is that there's been an overemphasis on the use of military force and a de-emphasis on traditional law enforcement. Where prior to 9/11, most counterterrorism efforts focused on regular investigations of terrorist plots. A lot of that time and energy has now been put into military forces, the armed forces. And as a result, although there have still been ongoing terrorism trials and the like, not to the extent that we'd had prior to September 11th. And of course, the problem of terrorism is something that we'll never get rid of. As a tactic, it can be prevented. Individual attacks can be stopped, and groups caught or defeated. But the actual tactic of terrorism isn't something that we're liable to be able to prevent the spread of. Thank you guys for bearing with me over this presentation, and thanks.